Dr. Kumbu, how are you today?
I am doing very well, Dr. Kim.
Oh,
What a next exciting session we're going to have. Exciting.
that's right. That's right. We're going to look at Wakanda Forever together. And I love your background, and you continually bring to life different images from Africa. And I love that image right behind you. It seems like you're out in the savannah right now with the animals.
Yes, I have to do that because until I go back to the continent, that's one of the ways that I comfort myself and then I bring it to the wall, like you're saying. I just love the scenery that is across Africa in different diverse, from savannas to the forest to the desert. It's very diverse scenery.
That's right. It's beautiful. And I hope one day I'd be able to see it in person one day. I've only seen zebras in zoos, which is a very sad thing. So I hope that becomes a reality as well one day.
Yes, so we got to plan a trip across East Africa and West Africa too, you know.
That's right.
Oh, speaking of scenery,
Yep.
do you want to talk about your scenery?
Oh yeah, so you probably know this is
I
Wakanda
love
in the
it.
background, and it's just such a beautiful landscape. And I love the fact that they incorporated the natural landscape, the mountains and all the greenery in the background, and then integrated the river through the city. And I think from what I've heard, they based this on some real life location in Africa as well too. So I love that. I love that film is taking reality and then creating something from that, like running with their imagination, but it's still true to sort of an African feeling or African spirit. So I love that as well too.
Wonderful. It's very futuristic.
Futuristic. Yeah, but also I feel like there's something very natural about it too.
It is. The colors are very natural.
Yeah.
And it has that old. So even though the buildings, the way they're built looks futuristic, the colors make them look old. It looks like it has a lot of history in it. And it reminds me like a Wakanda version of being in Scotland. Yeah, and being in Edinburgh. I had that very old feeling in Edinburgh. The buildings were just unique. They looked like they were molded, but they were just old buildings and very unique. And that gives me that feel of history and culture. Yeah. Good choice. Thank you. We're going to conclude that you are in the city of Wakanda in this conversation. I am at the outskirts of Wakanda in this conversation.
Wonderful. So what did you think about the film, Dr. Kumbu?
Oh, I have to say that I wasn't impressed by this film. I'm very conflicted. I think I walked away puzzled. I feel like puzzled is more of the word. There's this thing in culture that I constantly look at, coming from a colonial background, coming and studying Western ways, being in the Western influenced religion or Christianity and things that are so different from my tribe. There tends to be a conflicting identity sometimes in these things. And I walked away really struggling with this movie. I felt like they didn't give it the time that the story needed to mature. And because the story felt fragmented, I walked away feeling fragmented. It could have been the purpose of the film to get me all fragmented, but the fragmentation made me not enjoy the movie as much as I would have loved to enjoy the movie. The expectations I had for the movie going in, I walked away quite satisfied that it was done well. The acting was great. The giving honor to the late King T'Challa was wonderfully and beautifully done, and reflected even I had just gone to a funeral that weekend. So, and we were all dressed in all white, and it's an East African country. So I felt like that scene was generally well done. Yeah. But overall, I felt like this movie was 70 to 75% for me. Not, yeah.
Do you feel some of that was because of the expectations that you had based on the first film and how really overwhelmingly positive, I think, sort of the global response was to that film? And not that this film wasn't successful in the box office. You know, we know that it made over $700 million around the world since it opened, but I feel like part of this is related to the setup of the film based on the first one and us transitioning now to the second one. And I'm wondering also, and it's a question, do you feel like Chadwick Boseman's death and passing, do you feel that had an impact on the storyline and the execution of the production of the film?
Yes, I think that Boseman being a part of this film, being the caliber of an actor that he was, I believe that he probably would have pushed for he would have strengthened the storyline in other way, and his caliber could have been like, this storyline, you need to adjust it, fix it, modify it. I think he had the power to do something like that. So him not being in the film really impacted how the story was told. And then being that they wanted to give credit, they wanted to honor him in the movie, also kind of gave it a different feel. Like you said, coming in with expectations from part one and having this movie, I know a lot of people have said, well, this movie wasn't about the action. It was more about grief and how different people deal with grief. I understand that, but at the same time, I think that they had too many grievances or grief stories going on in one story that already had a very real life grief and a fictional grief.
Yeah.
So there was just too much of grief in the movie that made it in a way that the movie just felt like it was all over the place story-wise.
Yeah, I think part of my response to the film is just that. You know, I think that there's this representation of real life in the film, right? That Chadwick Boseman passed in real life and his character passed in the film. And I think that narrative is both compelling because reality and fiction are in complete alignment there. And it's an opportunity for the public to be able to respond with grief and with the stages of loss and grief and mourning. But at the same time, I think, as you mentioned, this decision to focus on grief really did help shape the entire storyline, right? And I'm wondering if the storyline, if there were multiple versions, right? Sort of like in sort of the Marvel language, multiverses, right? If there were multiple possibilities or multiple scripts that were on the table, and the one that got chosen was the one that was driven by, again, reality, which is Boseman's passing. I'm wondering if that really did constrain the creativity of the filmmakers, that perhaps they had to make certain choices based on that fact and that reality.
I think you have something there, because honestly, after having worked 17 years in entertainment and been on TV shows and watch how writers have evolved, especially on one show, how they've gone from older, mature to younger and younger and younger and younger and college interns. It gave me that vibe of this script had multiple script, like you said, like multiple young people had their different ideas of where it should go. And this one was picked up, or they took a bunch of ideas and tried to merge them together to make this one work, which is different from the first one, because the first one felt like two people sat down on the story and they just worked on it and polished it and polished it and polished it and polished it, so much so that by the time it got to market, it was so aligned so neatly that it was very hard to pick on it.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is the first film was really cohesive, right? You had a strong protagonist-antagonist relationship. There was a rise and a fall in the action. This film, I agree with you. We start at a low point in the beginning of the film, right? And that's hard to deal with, right? That it's hard to come out of that because there was no investment into the characters themselves outside of what we knew from the first film. So as a standalone film, how do you think that, Black Panther 2, how do you feel that Wakanda Forever stands on its own as a film? If an audience had not had the privilege of watching Black Panther, the original movie, how does this film fare?
It doesn't. It needs crutches. The film needs a ton of crutches. I don't understand Namo's story unless I understand colonialism. Otherwise, it's just a piece of entertainment. It was entertaining to some people. I don't understand why Shuri is panicking in the beginning, and all of a sudden there's an image of somebody that she's mourning. Like it doesn't have. There's no legs. Even in the African storytelling, if I remember being on this fireside with my grandma or my great auntie, or even just us, the older people telling stories to the younger people, the stories that we would tell, and then we would stop for the night because we needed to go to sleep. It was just too long. You couldn't finish the story. So the next morning, you're so excited to come back to this movie. And then to this story the next day. By evening time, everybody's cleaning up, eating, putting away things, and then you gather around because it's story time, right? And then you sit there. Sometimes you have guests in your home that evening at story time. You're not picking up from where you left off. No, they always go back. They always go back. They go back and give a brief overview of what we were talking about. And then picked up from somewhere. And to me, I would have very much loved them to pick up this movie from the death of Warmonger. I would have preferred a little bit of a background, a little bit of a narrative. Like in the beginning, they do a narrative. I would have preferred a little bit of a narrative before jumping into Shuri panicking. So this movie doesn't stand. You have to see one, and now I have an expectation to see 3.
That's right.
In order to draw conclusions.
That's right. Yeah, now that you mention it, just in terms of narrative and storytelling, I can remember parts of this film very vividly. I can remember specific scenes and specific dialogues, but it's a very unmemorable film for me overall, even though there's specific things I do remember. Like Black Panther, the original film, that had such an imprint on my mind that it is unforgettable. I don't feel the same way about that. And I don't know why. I can't put it into words. I don't know why, but it's just it's not memorable for me.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said you can't put into words, because so many times as I was thinking of our time today, so many times I kept saying, I cannot really describe this movie. Like this movie just seems like it's just a placeholder. It's just nothing about this movie. Like I have more critique of this movie than I have applauds. And I actually was thinking of Black Adam more. About it. Like I keep feeling like we should have been talking about Black Adam, not this movie. Like what's going on? Like so you're feeling I I'm glad you shared that part because I have just been in a daze about this movie. Like, what's up? What happened?
Yeah. I mean, the film had such great production value. Again, the acting was stellar. You know,
Amazing.
there was so much of, and again, a $700 million box office return is not like an average film. It is one of the best films in history.
Yes.
And yet, how is it that it's so unmemorable?
I know.
You know?
I feel somebody said there was just so much hype. And because one was so good,
Yeah.
everybody went to the theater.
Yeah.
It like everybody was wanting to see this. I know somebody that, well, I don't know them personally, but my nephew drove somebody to Orange County who was trying to see the movie before anybody. Like some theaters show it before.
Yeah.
So it was like, and then when they had seen it, and my nephew was bringing them home, and they were so annoyed. They were so disappointed because the hype, like we cherished one so much that we were all so hyped up about two.
That's
that
right.
when two came around, it just didn't do it. And I don't think it's only because of Chatworth not being there. It's story. It's how the story was told. I talked to I didn't talk. I talked to one African that I really respect, intellectual, loves the history, and they were like, no, I'm not gonna see it.
Oh.
And then I watch another historian talk about it. Nope, I'm not gonna see it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the African historians, they don't want to see this movie. They think they think African history has been embellished and embezzled or distorted or lied about so much that they don't want to see fictionized African stories. So I'm trying to get us to the point where like the whole colonialism part of it and the whole African heroes. So there's disagreement that even though this is fiction, in the beginning you said it nicely, fiction mirrors reality. I think, is that what you said?
That's right.
So with fiction, like now they're looking at it, this is not the reality in Africa. You're not mirroring the reality in Africa, even though this is fiction. And they don't believe that African stories should be fictionized because it needs to be reclaimed. There's a lot of heroes. There's a lot that Africa has given.
That's right.
That instead of fictionizing African stories, tell real African stories. Like tell real African heroes. Like, for example, I was looking at, if you wanted to bring the continent, say you wanted to bring representation from another continent, if you wanted to keep it all together as an African-based story from that part of the world and bring in colonization, or even touch on, because colonization only came after slavery had already been. So it's like the daughter of colonization is like the daughter of slavery. So if I want to connect those two, why not look at a hero that was on the like a Haiti hero, like the African, the Congo slave in Mexico that rioted. I think his name Unganga, something like Ganga, and he was somebody that could have been a transition to, you know how they brought in warmonger. You want to bring in another hero. You could have brought in those slaves that came to the Americas and actually fought their way and had their own villages on this continent and fought against slaves and won and had their own, and they were heroes. So why didn't you bring in that? It wasn't necessary. So it's like African historians will prefer stories that mirror truth, because we could mirror the truth and still have a really good Marvel's universe story here with African heroes. How did you feel about the heroes?
Well, and before I share mine, I find that to be such a compelling and inspirational way to talk about history, about culture, about identity. I think that the film, for me, what it tries to do is at the same time, it tries to mirror some cultural artifacts, cultural rituals, um, cultural objects, cultural rights and values. But at the same time, it is a work of fiction. And it's a work of fiction that's based on another work of fiction, right? So the film is based on the comic book. And the comic book lives in, I mean, it was born out of, to say crassly, a white man's brain, right? And it came out of his perspective of what Africa could be, or of how Africa is today, maybe, or has been in the past. And I feel like the whole question of the colonizer in particular, there's a running joke throughout the film.
Yeah.
Like she keeps talking about her favorite colonizer, and it's almost like that character it's almost like he's a eunuch in the film. He has no power, and I think it's intentional that he doesn't. But I think in a way that is not reflective of reality either.
Yes.
Because there is a power imbalance between white and black, between the North and the South. And I think that to just create a comedy out of that interaction, it's us sort of laughing because we're uncomfortable at it. We're not laughing because it is authentically joy-giving, right? We're not laughing out of happiness and joy. We're laughing because, there is truth in that, right? He still is a colonizer, but in the film, again, he has no power to be a colonizer because all that power has been stripped from him. And so again, I feel like those are some of the tensions for me that don't get really resolved in the film and aren't reflective of reality. And I think in that sense, it does the nations in Africa, it does them in injustice. The peoples of Africa, it does them in injustice. And I guess I would compare this to, you talked about Black Adam, I'd compare this film a little bit to The Woman King. And I think that The Woman King also does a lot of fictionalization, but it retains this flavor of truthfulness that it's believable, and at the same time it tells a story. It's storytelling, and there's always embellishment from any perspective. Anyone who tells a story, there's something that they add to it, if not in the words, in just the way that they're expressing themselves, their gestures or their intonations or their pauses or their pacing. There is always a subjectivity when it comes to storytelling. Even if you just read a script, even if you just read from a page, there is an inherent subjectivity in that storytelling. But I feel like The Woman King is perhaps a little bit more, and I'm wondering, did those historians watch The Woman King? The ones that did not watch Wakanda Forever, did they watch The Woman King, and did they have a different perspective on that?
Right. They did watch, one of them did watch The Woman King, and they watched it because The Woman King is based off of a true heroes.
That's right.
Right. So for them, it's almost a way of reclaiming the African story. So for that reason, they watch it. Yeah. So say, for instance, if they have done the story on maybe King Leopold that was fighting against the Portuguese because his people were just being taken in the name of religion, and wrote that letter to the Portuguese queen, if they had done that, it would have been something that is reclaiming to show that African kings, not all of them were complicit in slave trade, right? Like they were fighting. There's a lot of people that fought back, in African heroes that fought back during slavery, or during even went to fight for their independence from colonialism. If it was something that was still based on that, then maybe they would have watched it because they feel like we want to reclaim our history. We don't want it. Even if it's a fictional war, even if it's a fictional war.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of complexity still left to be unpacked in this film. Yes. And I'd love to pick your brain about that specifically. How did you feel or not feel that the film succeeded in representing some aspect of Africa. We talked about the story not being authentically African, but were there elements in the film that were reflective, that did give honor to African culture or tradition or heritage or the people and their history?
I think the music, the dance it was still fictionized a bit, but it gave you that feel of burial and ceremony. So the difference in reality is that the dancing happens after the person has been buried. There is a ton of mourning and crying and screaming and all of that. After the person has been buried, and then you get the dancing. The dancing is not, let's dance the person to the grave. No, dancing is now we can clean up, we can celebrate. It's almost like a mini celebration of life right after the person is buried. And then a year after this, another celebration of life. So the burning of the clothes of that dress in our culture, in my tribe, I can speak clearly for my tribe, the person that is close to the family, which is usually a wife or husband, they wear black for a really long time, or they pick a certain color and they wear that same color for a year, and then they come and they take it out, and then they say they're washing of the widow or the widower. So they do a tradition, and then they get rid of that clothes. I think they burn it or bury it or something. And then after that, or they give, if it's a really nice material, they could give it away. After that, then there's a big celebration. They come have a bigger celebration where we call it cry die, is like a celebration. But before that, so that mirrored it a little bit, that burning of the clothing and really making peace with the ancestor, because the sacrifices that happened during that period also. So that was close enough. The queen taking over the kingdom was maybe in some tribes, but not any tribe that I know of. The queen doesn't take over. It's very male dominant, so it will move to the son, or if the son is too young, it will move to like a regent, somebody that is an overseer. And for me, what I was expecting to see, not that I didn't want, like even if the queen stayed queen at that point, that I didn't mind that. What really broke away for me and really didn't align for me, and I felt uncomfortable with, is the fact that Shuri, she didn't get a rite of passage. Shuri didn't get, for example, in my tribe, this is a live example. In my tribe, when our chief died, the son, who we're about the same age now, the son was very young. So they gave the leadership to a relative of the chief who was influential, and then they gave the son over to that person to raise them, help them become, because they were preparing them. As soon as they become an adult, they'll become the next chief, right? And the village was making sure that he got an education and all of that. So, well, I probably send this to my chief so that he can be like, he's now my chief, right? He was crowned now chief after when he became an adult, but he was always chief, right? He was always chief, even when we would hang out. He was always chief. So the thing is, I was expecting Mbako, for example, to take over the grooming of the next Black Panther. Even if he was temporarily heir over the kingdom, I needed to see that process of Mbako, especially because he said his brother entrusted her to him. So there's a huge, what I call in my cultural model, rite of passage. That huge rite of passage is missing.
That's right. That's right.
And I feel like it mirrors this colonial process of, let's just get rid of these African cultural systems and just throw in our own system, right? Like, oh, she's a technology wizard, so now she's good to go. No, it's not enough. Like, there's so much training in the African education process that you need to do to become somebody that is a ruler of a kingdom.
Yeah.
Right. So that jump for me was just, it really threw me off a lot, and it minimized the role that Mbaku could have played. Even if Mbaku didn't want to be king, even if Mbaku wanted to just be on the sideline, Mbaku still could have played a major role in bringing Shuri to become the next Black Panther. And that gap was just wrong. And then the culture, the way Shuri talks to Mbaku is just disrespectful. Like, I want to smack her. Like, seriously. Like, the African mother in me wants to just go, Black, like, what are you doing? It doesn't matter whether you're Black Panther or not. You're not gonna bully him into going with you. Even your brother never did that. So that is a show of strength that is not normal to me as an African. That is a Western show of strength. That's the way I see American kids show strength. Yeah, that's not a show of strength to me. Is being able to softly convince my elders to go with me. It's not bullying my elders to go with me. Or it's not, you're gonna do this or you're gonna do this. Like, it just doesn't work. So those cultural, subtle cultural things that are not unique to the continent, but which the African child is going to see now and start copying. Because, like you said in the beginning, fiction mirrors reality. So we're going to start picking up these things. And I'm sure they're very aware of doing some of those things. Like, when you start putting things out there that are contrary to the ways of the people, then all of a sudden, in my first conversation, and I've read a lot of people say, this is just another way to colonize the African culture.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
So Dr. Kumbu, so just my reflection on what I've just listened to. I'm getting the feeling that you are not simply saying that the film was inaccurate. You are in fact saying that the film dishonors African culture and African values and African ways of understanding life and community and respectfulness and what it means to, treat your elders with a certain type of honor. That there's this dishonoring of that. You have there is this undertone. I can sense it in even the ways that your gesturing and your eye contact with me and the tone with which you're speaking about this. There's this frustration. It's not just a confusion, I would say, that there's a bit of angst about, could this have been done a different way? And what is the impact of this? When we talked about fiction mirroring reality, in this case, it doesn't, right? But then you talked about how fiction could then potentially influence reality, but perhaps in a negative way. And I'm wondering also about this whole concept of, and again, I'm going to use crass terms, so I apologize for it, but the white colonizer or the white man using the Black body as a surrogate for his own ambition, right? So his way of seeing the world being embodied in Black characters in order to promulgate that, in order to propose that this is an African way of being, and this should be an African's perspective on things like, I think embedded in this is a sense of strong feminism, right? Sort of breaking sort of gender roles. So I see that the strength with which Shuri presents herself, I think, is meant to embody this strong feminine voice. But what I'm hearing from you is that strong feminine voice in the context of Africa would look very much different than the way that the film portrayed it.
I agree. Yes, you picked that up correctly, and I think I one in Black Panther 1, the woman power that was in Black Panther 1 was the kind of woman power I expect to see in an African context. In Black Panther 2, the woman power that is in Black Panther 2 is not the woman power that I ever would want to see in the African context. I would never raise my daughters to have that kind of woman power in Black Panther 2. Like, I want them, I don't mind my daughter becoming a Shuri, but I want my daughter to be able to respect their elders in the same process, to be able to be diplomatic in a way that they interact with their elders, with the power that they have. One of the reasons I've said I have a PhD, one of the reasons why I have a PhD is because, okay, fine, as a Black woman, I am petite. There's so much about me that I can, within my brothers and sisters, I look like I'm the youngest, but I'm not. So it's like, it's easy for me not to have the power that I actually have. But because of the structural systems, my brothers can talk to me sometimes rudely, but they know that there's consequences to talking to me rudely, right? Like they still know that the power that I have as their big sister. And it's not because I have been, like, I'm demanding it. I'm not demanding it. I've just earned it over years. Being the first child is one, and I've worked really hard to earn the respect that I get from my siblings. I don't see Shuri earning any respect. I just see her taking a drink and then all of a sudden thinking that she can talk other people around. That's not power. That's not power. Like, it just doesn't sit right with the culture. And I really hope that African children do not mimic this Western way, because even in my research, I kept using the word mimicking of the West purposefully, because there is a lot of mimicking of the West.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, there are things that we can learn and adopt and adapt to our culture.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have to mimic directly everything that they do. And yes, this is fictional, but trust me, to some of those minds out there that cannot distinguish really clearly what is fictional and what's not, their minds are very fragile and very easy to influence. So we can dismiss it as saying this is a fictional film, but no. There's an African child that is going to watch this, and they're going to all of a sudden think that they can start talking disrespectfully.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We know from history that the most repressive governments, the most authoritarian governments, the most violent governments have always focused on media and entertainment as a vehicle to shape and change and guide generations, young and old, towards an ideology that they would never personally ascribe to. You think about Nazism. German people aren't inherently violent or evil or racist. They're not any more than anyone else is. And yet, because of this cultural machinery that Germany used in its service, they converted an entire nation of otherwise peaceful, productive, healthy people into people that supported, and maybe some people were against it, but at least, in the streets and in the public square, they remain supportive of the actions of that government in murdering millions of innocent people and waging war against the world. And I think that there is something very poignant and powerful about your statement that we need to pay careful attention. That's what we're doing. We need to pay careful attention to the messaging in films. We need to pay careful attention to representation in films. We need to pay careful attention, and we need to critique it. We need to be honest about it. We need to have conversations about it, and we need to hear maybe some things that I didn't even notice or see or perceive that my brother or my sister or my neighbor or even my enemy, they might be able to see something I haven't seen. And so engaging in this dialogue is such a rare opportunity, and I relish this chance to be here with you through Zoom, we're not in the same room together. We did get to watch the movie. I want to note for our audience, we did get to watch the movie together.
Yes.
We were aiming for a middle ground, and I think there were African Americans, there were Black people in the audience, as well as Latinos and people from diverse backgrounds. So we chose that intentionally as our meeting place, and I love that.
Yeah, and it was, you could hear the Black people in the back. I could hear them.
I heard them too. I heard them too. I heard the commentary. Yeah.
I was like, oh, they're here.
So, Dr. Kumbu, can I ask a few more questions? I was watching the film, and certain things I sort of put together. I pieced together what the meanings and what the symbology of some of these things that I was seeing implied. But some of the things I still have questions about, and you made mention of a few of those things. And just recently, you talked about this respect for elders. And I think that it sounds like that's an important part of African culture. And it's not just about little girls respecting older men. It's about all children respecting their elders, right? I don't think that was the implication, that it's like only girls have to do it, not boys, but everyone, that there is a respect for elders. I mean, I think about the images that I have of there's a village chief, but then you always have like village elders as well too. And they're an important part of, again, they do the storytelling, they give wisdom to the chief. There's this council of elders, something that I think we're missing to a large degree in the West, just because we're so individualized, and it's almost part of our view of democracy, right? That we're all sort of peers and equals. And in that sense, we break down some of that proper respect that we should have for people that have gone through much more of life than we ever have, that have much more experience, that have presumably some wisdom that we don't have as well too. So could you unpack a little bit about that in relationship to the funeral scene, where they talk about, I think the queen talks to Shuri and says, your brother is with his ancestors now, as a form of both, there's this cultural communication of their beliefs and values, but I think as a way to comfort her as well too. But again, this notion that your ancestors are important, that your elders are important. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. So is the concept of heaven, right? So when somebody dies, you're like, they're in heaven, they're with Jesus now. In the African tribe, they're with their ancestors now. So it's consoling to know that they are in good hands. They're there with their families and their ancestors. When it comes to ancestors, I don't know, maybe I'm going to diverge a bit, but I want to sit on ancestors for a little bit, and the role of Shuri and ancestors. So you can tell from the whole respect thing, we already know that Shuri doesn't respect the customs because she's a technology whiz and all of that. So she doesn't respect the customs. Right. And I think Baku was like, so now, like, okay, you've matured enough, even though I was like, I haven't seen her mature. So please, still being rude. So she still haven't gained the whole respect of the culture. And I did miss in the film not to see the ancestral plane. I think one of the most fascinating things to see all those elders, all those people in the ancestral plane. I think it was super, super beautiful in the first film to see that. I did miss that. I would have loved to see Shuri go through the process and appear in the ancestral plane. But since they were saying that she didn't believe, so she would not. So it's the same as a warmonger only saw his father at their home in Auckland. She saw warmonger, and then later saw her mother. So in that point, I'm like, you know how they say, if you don't believe in Jesus Christ, you're not going to go to heaven. It's like at this point, I'm like, wait, are you therefore telling me that because of her disrespect or her lack of love for the culture, she's not going to be in the ancestral plane, even though people from the ancestral plane can come to her? Because that's another traditional belief, right? That your ancestor can appear to you and things like that. It might be borrowed from other cultures too. It's almost like your ancestors are always with you. Like, oh, I feel like my dad is right here or something. So maybe she will get premonition. She will get her ancestors come to her, but she's not going to the ancestral plane. So it kind of was like, it gave me pause. Like, why did you do that?
Mm.
So she needs to really shape up if she wants to be in the ancestral plane. So that was one thing about the respect in that. I didn't this, and then when they moved all the people to the kingdom, like when they all went to the elders all went to Mbaku's kingdom, and it was, I don't know, it felt just disorganized. It didn't, that particular scene didn't serve a lot of purpose to me. And then when she came into the scene, compared to T'Challa, you didn't feel that connection with the elders.
Yeah.
She came in and then she does this whole little hand wrestling thing in the air, which I was like, I did hand wrestling with guys growing up, but sometimes I'll beat some of them, sometimes they'll beat me. That was not a rite of passage. That was not enough for you to like be like, oh, now Mbaku is gonna bow to me because hey. So it was very bizarre. It was just like they just elevating this young girl and letting her miss out on what it really means to leverage your ancestors or the elders in the room. So in these movies, the elders to me were voiceless. The first time we see them, they were arguing. And then Baku came in and was arguing and with the general. Like there wasn't a lot of the kind of joy I had seeing how ancestor contributed in Wakanda 1. I didn't see it here.
Yeah.
I didn't, and that is the borrowed culture, right? That somehow they're mirroring how the West does democracy compared to how Africa does democracy.
Interesting.
So our democracy is those quarter heads, elders, heads of families. Then you go to the chief's council, and then you go to the chief. Right? So there's like levels to it. Yeah. Like you might call it a hierarchy, but there is still a degree of democracy in there that takes each group. Those people don't just go speak. Like the quarter head meets with the heads of the families in a meeting. They discuss something. And then it goes to the next level, and then it goes to the next level.
Yeah.
So the voice is being moved up.
Yeah, that was completely absent in the film.
Yeah.
So do you feel that in Africa today, and again, we talk about, I'm doing the same thing. We tend to generalize Africa as if it's a country. It's a continent made of so many different countries and beliefs and values and systems. But in your experience in Africa, do you feel that respect for elders and this whole concept of ancestors being with us, and that in that sense, when you talk about ancestors being with us, it's comforting to know that, but it's also honoring to the ancestors, right? Do you feel that that's part of the African fabric today? Like, is that something that's prevalent today? Is that something that's stable and strong as a belief system? Or is it in decline? Is it something that the young generation no longer adheres to? Maybe even they might reject it because, again, Shuri represents that next generation, right? The intellectual, the technologically advanced, the educated, and the one that has sort of forward thinking, right? And the opposite of forward thinking is backwards thinking, which is oftentimes associated with things like superstition, right? Or things like spirituality. Right. And so we see that in many countries that have developed, you see them moving away from tradition, away from this belief in other world, right? This belief in a world beyond the current world. Is that something that's reflected in reality in places that you know of in Africa, or where are we? I mean, how much does this film mirror then reality?
Right. So I love that you brought that up because let me start with the scene where she has to take the drink and have to bury herself, right? So she doesn't do it the traditional way. The excuse is, she doesn't bury herself under the dirt and everything. The excuse is, she needs to be in there in case they need to resuscitate her. But if you're so advanced and you have beads that you can put on people's body, you can just say, why don't you just go get covered up? The way the traditional way is doing, and then if you start choking, it's not like you're 6 feet under. You're like under just a little bit of dirt. So if that starts to happen, you're dying, they can always still get to your heart. So that was a lame excuse to do away with that whole covering thing. Now, then I'll give you that example. A second example, then I will give you the thread that I want to show you. The second example is when the general goes, I call her the general. You know who I'm talking about when I say the general, right? What's her name? The general. I think the woman general.
Yeah.
So once they go to the city, she sees an iPhone. She says, primitive. Right? Yes, she says primitive. That stood out. You know how we talk about them using colonialism?
Yeah.
Primitive is another word that they use. In Wakanda one, it was about the hair. She didn't want the wig because she think it was primitive. And then now she looks at their cell phone and she says primitive. So to me, there is that underlying tone, because growing up, it was considered, or colonialism says African culture is primitive. It's almost like they are trying really hard to show that Africa is not primitive in the movie. And that actually bothers me, because it's like, you don't need to prove nothing to anybody. Your culture is what it is, right? You don't need to go prove to them that your culture is not primitive by adopting ways that look like their ways.
That's right.
For example, I don't want to get buried in dirt to get that superstitious that power, so it can become all of this thing, because maybe it's primitive. So like Cesar, Bogart, Abbey, those are like writers that talk extensively about the West calling Africa primitive and pagan and backwards. So now this movie is, on the other hand, trying to say it's not backward. We're not backward. Let's do it this way, because that way we will not be backwards. Let's not rely on our ancestors so much. That way we're not backward. Let Shuri talk almost rudely to Baku. That way we are not backward. She's a woman standing up for herself. But Shuri can still do the stand up for herself without being rude, right? Without disrespect. That, because like you said, respect is one of the highest things in the fabric of Africa, of African cultures that I have interacted with. Every African culture I've interacted with, the underlying principle is respect. You have to deal with respect. If you don't have a degree of respect, it's seen, it's known, and you're known as the one that is a disrespectful child, disrespectful wife, disrespectful husband. Like, respect is so big. The way you dress, the way you talk, the way you look at elders, the way you interact with elders, all of it. It's like a lot of respect in every single thing. And once you don't have that, you lose trust. You lose trust. Because when you don't have respect, you definitely lose trust. So when I wanted to really make sure that we tie in the whole mentality of trying to break away from what the West has been saying, that we're primitive, and then using it against the West. And then at the same time, we can see that we're shifting our ways to mirror or mimic the West, so that they will not stop calling, so they will stop calling us primitive. So even though it's a fiction, I could see that thread lined out throughout. And putting our elders out of the picture, putting our men out of the picture. Equality doesn't mean dismissal of men. To me, equality is not dismissal of men. Equality between men and women is not that the men have to be on the sidelines while the women just do everything. That's not equality to me. Men are as essential in every area of life as women are. We're trying to find a balance so that some people are not treated as less than, poorly, but it doesn't mean that we dismiss our men and put them on the sidelines. I don't care what the comics say. If you're going to portray to the African child something, please make it respectful of our culture. Don't just take our culture and put the dressing. Yes, we have the dressing in there. We love it. Thank you for doing that. Even with the character of Namo, bringing in Namo and things like that. You don't go touch on colonialism in a tribe haphazardly. That whole thing was so haphazard. Don't do that. You leave the person more wounded in the heart than anything. Like, you want to explore that situation, explore it to the full. Like, really, Namo should have been a movie of its own. It was not necessary to bring in colonialism by bringing in Namo. They should have just made a movie with Namo on its own. It would have been much more effective. And I would have gone and watched it 3 times. But because they put it so cheaply into this movie, and people are like, oh, this movie is so great. They took risks, they went and they touched on this and they touched on things that people don't usually talk about. They did, but they did not do it justice. And it left some of us that have been impacted by colonialism fractured. Like, I felt wounded more than impressed by that scene.
And
maybe because I'm an intellectual.
No, I mean, I see again your pain. I hear your pain, and again, it's more than just frustration. I really feel that there is a subtle offensiveness about the film, and the way that they characterize culture. Again, just building off of what you said about Namor and his people and his culture, as opposed to the colorful, vibrant, song and dance and food and all these wonderful artifacts of culture that you see in Wakanda. In the underworld kingdom, you see Shuri being guided through their kingdom, and I don't know that I saw anything. I just saw a bunch of children, and there was nothing about that indigenous culture that really shone, right? I mean, you don't see the same level of vibrance and creativity and richness that you do in the Wakandan storyline. And I think that to bring in sort of this Mayan, Mesoamerican culture and history and present them in a way in which they do not have any distinctness or uniqueness or even any cultural contribution other than they are the other, and that they're the other that has been antagonized and almost created to be this enemy of the world because of colonization, right? And then looking at that antagonism as being the ploy or the counterpoint to Wakandan, the Wakandan history and the Wakandan development of identity. I think that's really, really a shame. And it really does a disservice to, I think, all of us, because as we're looking for representations of how we can coexist and how we can come together and how we can even talk about our pain and talk about our histories, I think that doing this large sort of brushstroke over that what was supposed to be Mayan culture, I think really does paint them just like we paint all sort of peoples that we want to conquer ourselves as less than human. And so I felt like the film was colonizing that people group. I mean, it really was disturbing for me.
Yes, I am so glad you said that. I am so glad you said that, because it's like, it just felt like cultural colonization. And another person said, I used gentrification in the first part that I had recorded, and I read somebody else said the same thing: colonization, gentrification. Like, what are you doing? Don't do that to a people that are already so wounded and broken. Don't do that. If you're gonna do it, make it vibrant. And these people are vibrant people, even from the color of their clothes to everything.
Yep, that's right.
They are not what you're portraying. They survive. They survive genocides.
Yeah.
Don't bury them under the sea. They survived. Right? So I just felt so wounded by that. I did not like that at all. When I first made a comment about it, somebody thought I didn't want Namo. I wanted a Black person to be in that role. No, it's not about that. It's about treating a character properly with respect, and understanding what they have overcome and dealing with that. Don't take sensitive real life things and play with it. whether
Yeah.
it's fiction or non-fiction.
Yeah.
Don't do that. You're hurting people in the process. The people that actually are the thinkers and the people that actually want to make an impact in society, you don't do that because we are going to push back.
Yep.
We are going to push back. And that's why the African historians don't want to see this movie, because
That's right.
no, these
It is
are
offensive.
painful situations for
Yeah.
us.
I mean, either don't bring it in or don't pretend. Don't pretend like you're culturally forward and progressive. And I would have preferred if Namor was to be introduced as the antagonist in this film. Don't visit his culture, right? If you're not going to portray it honestly and authentically, don't do that. Don't have that be like, oh, look, we're giving honor to Mesoamericans now, just like we did for Africa. Now we're doing it for Middle America. And I think that, again, it's insulting. It really is insulting and offensive to do it in that way. Just if you want to just have an enemy, just make it Namor and just leave him without that cultural sort of the baggage that you're trying that he's carrying with him into this battle. Just make it about Namor. And then if you want to explore this, then dedicate a film like you did in Black Panther 1, dedicate a film about their story. Like, who are they? How did they get here? And what do they believe? We don't know anything about the people. We don't.
We don't. We just see blurb, all of a sudden.
And it's blurry. Yeah, it's underwater, so everything is blurry. Like, and it's sad.
I watch it twice and I'm still like, huh, what? So what? This scene. So what? This scene. Just so many little things on that scene that it just made you criticize the film more than actually critiquing it both ways. Like it's almost like I feel like all I do is criticize this film. But in Black Panther 1, all I did was parrot this film. One thing that they pointed out that was also a quick stroke of the brush to me, like you said, I really love that narrative, the way you said it, the description, is the UN scene where they bring in the people that they caught at the UN.
Yeah.
That too, if you're gonna touch on something, deal with the issue.
That's right.
That scene alone is a movie alone.
Yeah.
Like, we know, like, there's a lot of people that talk about how much a country like France, which was the country mentioned in the movie, is benefiting from Africa based on colonialism. Like, to the amount of 500 billion every year.
That's right. That's right.
If you're going to touch on something that is draining Africans and keeping them poor, why sending charity over there and making us look like we're the poor ones?
Yeah.
Then you should really address it. Don't make it look like, oh, now and then Wakanda captured them, and then with the woman, the queen threatened them, and then now we're all good. No, we're not all good. There's so much left to be done. Like, you saw that I had a wound, and you took a pick and you went, phew. You just scratched my wound and then left it open, and now it's hurting.
Because the reality is Wakanda is fictional, and there are countries like Sierra Leone that are one of the wealthiest nations in the world by resources. You shared that video with me. They're one of the wealthiest nations in the world by resources, and everyone wants their resources. So why aren't they Wakanda? Like Wakanda, because of its natural resource, that's how they built up their civilization. Why isn't Sierra Leone a thriving, democratic, open, progressive, and world power? And again, it's that post-colonialist in indebtedness now that is keeping them from becoming who perhaps they were meant to be. And I think in that TED talk that you shared with me, the speaker talks about how a former French president even admitted, if not for Sierra Leone, if not for those loan repayments, right, and the way that we are taking their natural resources, France would probably be a third world country now.
Yep.
I mean, what is that saying, though? Think about it, right? I mean, that's messed up. That's completely messed up. And the film doesn't really give that its day in the sun. It doesn't give it due justice. And another failure of the film.
Another failure of the film. It is another failure of the film because people are going to be like, hooray, they touch on that issue. So what? If you're really going to dig deep, dig deep. You're really going to go deep, go deep. Don't do this brush strokes. And that's why it feels like they're just taking advantage of our pain to make a Marvel film. So they're using us again. Like you're just using the colonized peoples again. You're not bringing in the 700 billion they've made. They're not going to share it with any of these tribes.
Of course not. Of course not. No. They're not going to give that back to Africa. No, that's not going to happen. No, not at all.
None of Mesoamericans are going to get a penny. We're not going to get a penny.
Oh, no. I don't remember if they said it this way, but I feel like I heard it somewhere. Someone called this cultural pornography.
Oh, that is a beautiful thing. That I thank that person for that. I could not find the right word. I call it cultural gentrification, but that's not enough because they're earning money. They're not just moving in. They're earning money.
That's right.
And we're not getting a penny out of it.
That's right.
So they've ripped our resources. Now they're ripping our culture to build storylines where at the end of the day, not even a penny is going to go back to help those tribes. Because these tribes are all like they're built, all these stories are built on tribes. Like when you look at the dressing, you can tell these are different tribes. Different tribes. These are all different tribes. So why can you go back and say, okay, I mirrored this from this tribe, the people with the hair, the people with the things, the lip in their mouth. Can you go back to those tribes and donate $1 million a piece to those tribes? You've got 700 million. Give them $1 million a piece. Every tribe that you reference in this movie, go back and give them $1 million. I'm not asking for too much, am I?
No. I mean, again, $700 million, that can help a lot of people. And I think that giving people what they deserve, not as charity, but you've benefited from someone else's cultural property. That property is not your own, but you're calling it your own, as if you have creative license over it. So, Dr. Kumba, I'm hoping we can end on a positive note, though.
Yes.
It's been very critical. But I feel like one of the amazing things about our conversation today has been we've centered a lot of our discussion about how reality is reflected and represented in fiction, in the film, right? But we know, and we've touched on this also, that film and fiction, for that matter, also influences reality. And so I just changed my background. I think you might have noticed.
I did.
And this is an architectural mock-up, and you know of this, you know a little bit about the story. It's an architectural mock-up of a city in Senegal called Akon City.
Akon was a musician.
That's right. But he is investing back into his people, his country, his culture, and he wants to create this forefront leading, innovative, groundbreaking new approach to development in Africa, where they're not imitating the West, they're creating architectural designs that are inherently African. I mean, you look at the beauty of these images here, and you can't find any of this in the West. This is not a Western picture of development. This is an inherently, authentically African view and vision of what their future could be. And it's not even future, it's today. I mean, they're building right now. And this is a multi-billion-dollar project. And I just love how, and people are calling this the Wakanda of Africa, right? Like as if Wakanda is like the image and the sort of stamp of sort of the ideal of African development and African prosperity. And yet I think it does give us some pause to think about, could this film in one way really distract from the proper and appropriate and right focus on culture that belongs to that culture and emerges out of that culture? Like, it doesn't do such a good job with that, but in the sense that it continues the conversation about what is Africa? Who is Africa, and who can she become, and who is she becoming? And dream, right? And for young Black boys and girls to be able to see themselves in a different way, as opposed
Yes.
to sort of the NGO pictures of the starving African, of the war-torn Africa, of the AIDS epidemic Africa, right? That there is this different vision of who they are, and I think perhaps maybe fiction could help change reality in that small way. What do you think about that, Dr.
I
Kumbuka?
do agree. I do agree. As much as I had such things to say about the movie, I do agree that it's beautiful when I watch little clips and I see the African children doing, like there is some degree of burst of confidence. There's some degree of we can do this. There's some degree of how can I create the Africa I want to see. So in that way, I am really happy to see this. I don't know whether this project was started before Wakanda ever came into being.
Maybe.
But
Yeah.
it's still nice to see that it's contributing to the narrative of let's build Africa based on our African values and culture. Let's build Africa. Let's not mimic the West. I've often said that it took hundreds and hundreds of years and a ton of slaves to build both Europe and Africa and America. So we in African continent today should not mimic the West. We should start conceptualizing how to build an Africa that reflects our Africa. We shouldn't build an Africa that I cannot have this background behind me. I want to have this background, but I want that when I build that kind of a building behind you, it mirrors both.
Yeah.
Like we can take let's adopt the cultures. Let's borrow universal principles. Let's adopt them. Because as we have talked before, culture is constantly changing and people constantly borrowing something from different people's cultures, right? So as we borrow and build, let's build an Africa. Let's build something that reflects us and not the West.
That's beautiful.
And Akon is doing it, and I'm so happy. And so at the end of the day, I am very happy. You made me really happy because at the end of the day, I was probably going to walk away in a depressed mood.
No, there is hope. There is hope. And I think there's a lot
hope.
of good people working towards that future. So thank you. Thank you for the conversation. It's been great spending time with you.
It was wonderful too. Thank you so much.